Welcome, good evening, and welcome to Princeton Public Library. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about the space's accessibility features. The community room is T-coil enabled. If you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we have made some available at the small table by the entrance, back there. I would also like to request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. My name is Jennifer Podolsky, and I'm the Executive Director of the Princeton Public Library. On behalf of the library and its trustees, I'd like to thank the Princeton Theological Seminary, President Jonathan Lee Walton, and the Office of the President for bringing their annual Martin Luther King Jr. lecture to the library and for all of the effort that has gone towards sharing this special event with the public. We are so grateful for the opportunity to host this program in partnership with the seminary and Labyrinth Books, and to welcome both the leadership of the seminary and our two distinguished speakers this evening, who will be introduced by President Walton. First, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Jonathan Lee Walton, who has been president of the Princeton Theological Seminary since 2023. Dr. Walton is trained as a social ethicist whose scholarship focuses on the intersection of evangelical Christianity, mass media, and political culture. He is the author of 2 acclaimed books and has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, CNN, and PBS. Dr. Walton earned his master's and doctorate degrees at the seminary and taught at Wake Forest and Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walton.
Good evening. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Lee Walton, and as president of Princeton Seminary, it is an honor to welcome you all here tonight to this year's annual Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture, a signature academic and moral event each year at the seminary. I'm particularly delighted that we are gathering tonight not within the walls of our chapel or a lecture hall or the Wright Library, but here in the heart of Princeton civic and cultural life, the Princeton Public Library. In collaboration with their adult programming department and the Public Humanities Initiative, along with Labyrinth Books. The scene and setting tonight is both symbolic and it's strategic. For as historian Timothy Snyder reminds us in his book on tyranny, institutions do not protect themselves. They endure only through our shared stewardship and sustained solidarity. Institutions like this library, Labyrinth Books, McCarter Theater, the university, and seminary exist to nurture imagination, to preserve memory, to provoke inquiry, and to defend intellectual and academic freedom. And when these institutions collaborate, when we pool our moral and our intellectual capital, we form a bulwark against the rising tides of censorship, historical amnesia, and anti-intellectualism. So therefore, we are so thankful to Jennifer Podolsky, the library's executive director, as well as the amazing team here at the Princeton Public Library for making this possible tonight. So tonight's lecture sits within this grand tradition. In 1998, the Black Concerns Council, a faculty committee at Princeton Seminary, proposed the establishment of a lectureship to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A student group, the Association of Black Seminarians, joined that call, and the seminary's faculty adopted the proposal. Since that time, this lecture has served as a commemoration and a charge. a moral reckoning with Dr. King's radical, though beautiful, theological and ethical vision. The lectureship was founded with several convictions: that the seminary's mission is incomplete if it does not engage the ongoing realities of racial and social injustice; that theological education must be intellectually rigorous, spiritually discerning, and publicly engaged; and that Dr. King's legacy as a theologian, an ethicist, and prophetic voice demands not sentimental reflection, but serious, sustained interpretation. The inaugural lecture in 1999 was none other than the towering theologian, Dr. James H. Cone. He delivered a lecture entitled Martin and Malcolm on Violence and Nonviolence. That inaugural lecture set the tone, unflinching in its critique, unrelenting in its call to moral clarity. And tonight, that tradition continues. It continues with this year's speaker, and Harvard University professor Brandon M. Terry. Professor Terry is a scholar whose intellectual rigor, moral courage, and generational voice places him squarely in the lineage of those who study King and those who help us see King anew. He is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University. He's a son of Baltimore who went on to earn his bachelor's degree from Harvard College and then his master's from Oxford before earning his PhD in political science and African American studies from Yale University. He is the co-editor with Tommy Shelby of To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King, Jr. This important collection that helped reframe King among philosophers as not merely as a civil rights leader, but as a political theorist of the highest order. And in that volume, and across Professor Terry's scholarship, he resists the domestication of King. He shows us the radical King, the tragic King, the philosophically exact King, the King whose dream was not a lullaby, but a lament regarding what he understood to be the long-haul work of justice. Professor Terry's forthcoming book, Shattered Dreams, Infinite Hope, with Harvard University Press, promises to deepen this tragic vision, interpreting the civil rights movement not as a linear arc of progress, but as a struggle defined by noble aspiration and enduring disappointments. Now, immediately following his lecture, Dr. Terry will be joined in dialogue with another towering scholar and premier public intellectual that many of you see walking up and down the street here on Nassau. Dr. Eddie S. Glaude is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. And among his list of impactful and influential books, he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America, and its urgent lessons for our own. Many of you will recognize him as the thoughtful and clear and compelling analyst on MSNBC. And in an era of performative punditry, Dr. Glaude's voice remains a refreshing blend of clarity, conviction, and care. Together, they will invite us to remember and wrestle with this legacy of Dr. King, to sit in between hope and despair, principle and pragmatism, love and justice. So friends, please join me putting your hands together and showing your love for Professor Brandon M. Terry.
Honestly, we could all go home now. I just have to say, before I begin in earnest, it is an extraordinary honor to be here with President Walton. He is one of the people in the academy and in the world who I most admire. His example as a teacher, as a scholar, as a husband and father is somebody that it just meant the world to me. We taught a class on Dr. King years ago now, but it's one of those things that I just find myself constantly called back to, remembering moments, remembering asides, remembering thoughtful wisdom that he was so gracious to share with me in those moments right at the beginning of my career. And it's just an honor to be back standing next to you, brother, and learning from you as always. It's amazing to see you, Cecily. Thank you for opening up your home to me and my wife and our kids in so many respects. And Professor Glaude, it's an extraordinary honor to be in conversation with you. I've been following your work for so long, and honestly, it's like I can't even think without some part of you in my mind. Because of whenever you pick up my new book forthcoming, you'll see a whole lot of Eddie Glaude in there. And I hope he'll find it interesting and provocative and criticize it where appropriate. Thank you, Sue Robertson, for getting me here safely in the crazy Newark airport. And thanks for the Princeton Library team and all the folks at the Theological Institute for all they've done to make this possible. Pessimism is cowardice. The man who cannot frankly acknowledge the Jim Crow car as a fact and yet live and hope is simply afraid either of himself or of the world. There is not in the world a more disgraceful denial of human brotherhood than the Jim Crow car of the Southern United States. But two, just as true, there's nothing more beautiful in the universe than sunset and moonlight on Montego Bay in far Jamaica. And both things are true, and both belong to this world, our world, and neither can be denied. These provocative sentences appear in an essay called Of Beauty and Death, the penultimate chapter in W.E.B. Du Bois's criminally underappreciated 1920 text, Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil, a book that was released at the beginning of what perceptive historians call the long civil rights movement. Taking the segregated rail car as synecdoche, as symbolic of the vast edifice of racial domination and economic inequality, consolidated in the aftermath of World War I, Du Bois asked the reader to concede some difficult truths. He wants us to honestly confront that the existence and persistence of such evils, such denials of human brotherhood, are a profound challenge. They make us question the worth of hope, the value of life, and the meaning or lack thereof of our possibility to care for the world. The failure to overcome such evil often drives us to a kind of despair that others do not respond with the same angst and indignation that we have facing such towering evil only adds to the weight of our seeming abandonment. Strikingly, across Du Bois's vast corpus of work, his most direct responses to these problems of pessimism are in this little essay on beauty and death. Why, we might ask, should he turn to the realm of aesthetics, questions of beauty, to do the work of political or even existential philosophy? What's at issue, he argues, is not so much what we know about the intricacies of inequality, the kinds of things social scientists study, but instead the cultivation of a sensibility, of a disposition that shapes our perspective and response to the world social scientists purport to describe. a disposition that might cultivate virtues of courage and hope without falling into delusion. The challenge, as Du Bois puts it, is to avoid any pert and easy word of encouragement or merely dark despair. Even if we grant all its ugliness and sin, he says, the petty, horrible snarl of its putrid threads, the beauty of this world is not to be denied. For Du Bois, something in this insight that evil is devastatingly real, yet not the totality of all that exists, is something that can steel us for the great battle for human emancipation. This seems particularly so in dark and uncertain times like 1920, or for that matter, 2025. A time where it seems like the great victories of one era are being slowly turned into the ruins of our present. One key to understanding Du Bois's vision, what I would call a tragic vision, lies in the same chapter. Immediately after these statements on pessimism, Du Bois takes a jarring turn to discuss, of all things, his aesthetic response to the Grand Canyon. Why? Well, Du Bois's encounter with this gargantuan natural wonder was a true aesthetic education on perspective and judgment. From the canyon's rim, we see through Du Bois's eyes an imposing landscape that is overpowering, violent, horrifying. He writes, it is a sudden void in the bosom of the earth down to its entrails, a wound where the dull titanic knife has turned and twisted in the hole, leaving its edges livid, scarred, jagged, and pulsing over the white and red and purple of its mighty flesh, while down below, down below, in black and severed vein, boils the dull and sullen flood of the Colorado. In a book notable for its furious depictions of lynching and the ritual mutilation and torture of Black people under Jim Crow, this description of the canyon is meant to echo those American horrors. It's apprehended first as violence and viscera, then as senselessness and profound disorder, magnified by an overwhelming absurdity of scale. The earth and sky gone stark and raving mad, he writes. The mountains uptwirled, disbodied and inverted, stand on their peaks and throw their boughs to the sky. Their earth is air. You stand upon their roots and fall into their pinnacles, a mighty mile. This surreal description makes it seem impossible to orient oneself in a world where such things loom. We lose grasp on our abilities to make distinctions or exercise discernment, key features of good judgment. Indeed, the canyon even seems to mock our finitude and our fragility. It casts disparagement on the grand traditions of our gods and the scribbled testaments of our prophets. If we listen closely, Du Bois implores, we hear the accents of that gorge which mutters, before Abraham was, I am. The juxtaposition between the canyon and Jim Crow, perhaps bewildering at first glance, is meant to offer an existential and epistemological analogy between resisting that racial order and the sublime experience of beholding the canyon. Echoing Immanuel Kant's famous description of the sublime in his third critique, Du Bois emphasizes that awe-inspiring dangers like the canyon initially highlight our fragility, but then somehow awaken the courage to uphold our deepest commitments. We swell with a sense of the possibility of the human. In Du Bois's Sublime, however, the transition from physical powerlessness to spiritual elevation is characterized by a unique focus on grace, disposition, and tradition. The occasion and source of our calling to this spiritual elevation in some respects comes from outside us. The challenge is whether we can achieve a perspectival shift that allows us to recognize these moments and somehow take them, seize upon them to redescribe the traditions we inherit, the finitude that is our condition, and the world we aim to act within. When we read it that way, we note that Du Bois's breathless narration of the frightening canyon culminates in the squinting awareness of a dawning light that transformed his sight in the morning. Crucially, the occasion of daybreak makes possible a new mode of action. He travels down from the towering canyon rim into the roiling Colorado River. He says, I've been down into the entrails of earth, down by straight and staring cliffs, down by sounding waters and sun-strewn meadows, down by green pastures and still waters, by great steep chasms, down by the gnarled and twisted fist of God to the deep, sad moan of this yellow river that did this thing of wonder. A little winding river with death in its depth and a crown of glory in its flying hair. How does this journey occasion a newfound courage? How does it enhance his insight, his sense of agency? What disposition does all of this description mean to cultivate in you, the reader? What's the relationship between all of this talk of the sublime and the perpetual problem of pessimism? I take this depiction of the Colorado River carving what he calls this thing of wonder to be one of his earliest and most important metaphors for what he would later call the long siege, the enduring, intergenerational social movement aimed at the accumulation and exercise of enough power to combat and maybe even defeat the enduring injustice experienced by African Americans and other oppressed people. By this idea of the long siege, Du Bois means to warn against the view, often expressed by the young, that a series of brilliant, immediate assaults will bring about our full liberation. The nature of the problem, he teaches, is just too knotty. The American racial order hangs together not simply on plain ignorance, vicious ill will, mass propaganda, or violent subjection. It also reflects deep economic interest, suffocating media control, and a maze of psychological complexes, unconscious habits, and irrational drives. Any genuinely egalitarian politics will therefore require an adjustment to and an awareness of the long duration and intergenerational character of a struggle that could meet the magnitude of its obstacle. That kind of adjustment would reshape us at the deepest level, levels of emotion, epistemology, education. It would shape how we make judgments, both political and existential. It would require courage, but courage of an increasingly unfamiliar sort. While Du Bois represents the contingent currents of human action and traditions of struggle through the Colorado River, he also shows, importantly, how the river's accumulated significance may be easily dismissed or imperceptible. Only a shift in perspective, dramatized as going down to the river, down the canyon, gives lie to pessimism. Yet this picture of the world is not one that licenses sunny optimism. The canyon image is straining to capture two things at once. Both Du Bois's sense of the enormous, deadly, and disorienting scale of our vast social problems, and his insistence that even that imposing landscape of domination and evil has been painstakingly reshaped by the often obscure agency of oppressed and ordinary people. To see the accumulated traces, to see the impact of these efforts, to grasp their possible meaning and significance, he's trying to teach you that you cannot remain on the rim. You cannot view history only in the spectatorial remove of the third person, one who's content to survey all of humanity through mechanistically causal or externally imposed forms of explanation. You have to go down to the river, so to speak, and think from the first person. Try to understand the normative dreams, the principles, the standpoints of others, past and present. When we capture that mode of thinking, we can judge their efforts from a new perspective. We can refuse a fully objectifying stance toward their exercises of judgment and action and our own. Now, the genius of the passage is that all of this is eerily reflected in the canyon itself. The nature writer Craig Childs, who studies the impact of the river's floods, notes how, quote, every physical element of a canyon network is mercurial, with no hard givens, no solid obstacles. The flexible aspects of a flood, people like him study this, they call them degrees of freedom, of all things. And Childs draws our notice to the way that concept measures the rate at which objects give way to pressure. The quick erosion of sand, the steady wearing back of stone walls, and the instant recoil of water hitting a boulder. In the canyon, he writes, everything changes shape. Now, this insight in a different register was also central to Raymond Williams' path-breaking account of tragedy, of the revolutionary potential of tragic thinking. And it's why I think it's appropriate to call Du Bois's vision a tragic one. Williams argues that if we watch history only as detached spectators, we see everything as inevitable and grow indifferent and pessimistic about them and ourselves. But when we recognize our active role and the energy unleashed by struggles against oppression, we realize that revolutionary action constantly renews itself as people struggle against the shortcomings of the previous struggles. Embracing that tragic vision, attending to both defeat and the spirit that fights back, is the only way, he teaches, to sustain genuine, ongoing liberation. This approach, I think, is resonant with Du Bois's aesthetic reflections, both on the canyon and his broader remarks on ugliness and beauty. Du Bois warns us not to mistake the eternal nature of ugliness with its completeness. Its internal unfulfillment, Du Bois writes of ugliness, is a cause of joy. Yet he also warns us not to follow those who, contradicting their own knowledge and experience, try to say that all is beauty. They are called optimists, and they lie. Now, that statement's not just a philosophy of aesthetics. It's one of politics and historical judgment. Du Bois offers a critique of what I would call, in my larger work on the civil rights movement, romantic histories. Histories that evade ugliness and social evil by telling us fables of complete triumph and exaggerating the stories of unity and consensus. But he also offers, just as importantly, a critique of those narrators of ironic and pessimistic history who insist that ugliness is all we need to know, and that the only lesson incumbent upon us to learn from history is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Instead, Du Bois, from his ruminations on Alexander Crummell to John Brown to Reconstruction, returns again and again to the idea of a splendid failure, one that deserves our mourning, one that deserves us our sustained lingering over the wounds, defeats, and lost causes that they represent. But why? I think Du Bois's approach is motivated by three sensibilities. The first is that the significance of exemplary historical events, like the long civil rights movement, are not determined by just their defeat or partial failure. History is full of Du Bois's splendid failures, and these can be returned to, made new and uncanny, They can inspire our own struggles and sharpen our own sense of judgment and possibility when put in powerful juxtaposition with what we think we know. Second is that our memory of their existence is part of what makes ugliness and injustice incomplete. From the vantage of these stories, we can reopen what looks settled. We can criticize what gets celebrated as progress. We can unmask what seems inevitable. Reanimating these hopes from the past to burst open the present helps us beat back ideological attempts to reconcile us to catastrophic defeats and misname them victories or rational progress. Third, if we really investigate these exemplary moments, and this is what we learn from Du Bois as a historian, we really investigate these moments and try to reconstruct them with a serious eye toward the dreams and judgments of their participants, the minutia of the actions and judgments they were making in the course of human action, we will reveal much more than seems possible from the third person remove, the kind of contingencies, the kind of chances, the structures of opportunity that are not visible any other way. That kind of careful historical and political work renews our sense that things could have turned out differently, that things could have turned out better. It's a style of subjunctive thinking. What roads were not taken? And it's not just for historical curiosity. It's to train your judgment, to seek out such opportunities in the present where others do not see them, and to act decisively to seize upon them with principled action. The meaning of past events lies ultimately in the guardianship of the present, as Terry Eagleton argues. The dead cannot be resurrected, but there is a tragic form of hope whereby they can be invested with new meaning, interpreted otherwise, woven into a narrative which they themselves could not have foretold. What makes this question especially pressing for us, as Frederick Jameson warned long ago, is that any egalitarian struggle has to deal with the problem of death. The most urgent question of radical egalitarian politics, Jameson inconveniently reminds us, remains that of individual sacrifice, the renunciations made by present generations for the benefit of generations in the future they will not themselves see. Something like that challenge must have been on Du Bois's mind in his final days. On June 26, 1957, he composed a final message to the world where he wrote, "I have been uplifted by the thought that what I have done well will live long and justify my life. That what I have done ill or never finished can be handed on to others for endless days to be finished, perhaps better than I could have done." A few years later, Du Bois died, of all days, on August 27th, 1963, just hours before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. With eerily mosaic resonance, Du Bois would not live to see the moral authority of the long civil rights movement crystallized in the witness of the world. Roy Wilkins, the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, begrudgingly announced the radical Du Bois's death with a moment of silence before the assembled crowd. Later that afternoon, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which would become the exemplary text in the public political memory of the civil rights movement and an inexhaustible source of romantic rhetoric of dreams and dreaming that today's critique struggles to resist and repurpose. Taking that weighty inheritance seriously, a tragic vision of the civil rights movement, one in Du Bois's spirit, might proceed by offering a different interpretive key. One found in King's largely ignored sermon, sometimes delivered as unfulfilled hopes, but published in Strength to Love as Shattered Dreams in 1963, that same decisive year. What does it mean that the author of I Have a Dream released in that same year a book of sermons that argues that shattered dreams are a hallmark of our mortal life and one of the most agonizing problems within our human experiment? What does it mean that King insists that few, if any of us, live to see our fondest hopes fulfilled, and that we must determine how to live in a world where our highest hopes are not satisfied? While many Americans can quote King's stanzas about holding hands across the color line, it is crucial, I think more crucial to his political philosophic practice, that I Have a Dream begins with the shattered dreams of emancipation. It begins with the bitter marking of 1963 as a time when, a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. In King's view, the question that is utterly fundamental to the philosophical problem space of the civil rights movement is whether our shattered dreams should authorize philosophies of bitterness, withdrawal, and detachment from the world, whether they compel us toward paralyzing determinism and fatalism, as he put it. King's response, from which the title of my forthcoming book is drawn, asks for our willing acceptance of unwanted and unfortunate circumstances, even as we still cling to a radiant hope. He asks that we navigate finite disappointment, even as we adhere to infinite hope. This claim, I think, can be taken in two directions. The first is unapologetically metaphysical. If we die without receiving the earthly promise of our fulfilled hopes, King suggests that God shall lead us down that mysterious road called death, and at least to that indescribable city he has prepared for us. Our earthly life, he declares, is a prelude to a glorious new awakening, and our death is an open door that leads us into life eternal. Now, even if this manages to provide some motivation for the struggle for justice, convincing us to risk our lives, in effect, by offering us something greater in the afterlife, there's a reasonable worry that this mode of faith devalues this life and ultimately weakens our sense of what is at stake in the here and now. In the reflected glow of heavenly repose, critics contend, the grinding suffering and struggle of politics, even of the extraordinary sort he practiced, seems unlikely to elicit the deep attachment and attention constitutive of a sustained care for the moral world. This is an argument trenchantly pressed, of course, by Malcolm X, who said this blue-eyed devil has twisted his Christianity to keep his foot on our backs, to keep our eyes fixed on the pie in the sky and heaven in the hereafter, while he enjoys his heaven right here on this earth in this life. But King's account of shattered dreams has another valence, one that we shouldn't overlook. It's not a religious faith that seeks to absolve us of loss or even inure us to the crosses we must bear. It's instead a faith that is stridently political and strengthens one's resolve to struggle in the face of profound isolation and abandonment, to struggle in the face of mounting oppression and reaction. It provides a measure of peace, in King's words, amid the howl and rage of outer storm, and represents what he sees as the essential political core of both early and Afro-American Christianity. He understood both as forged in the crucible of oppression and enslavement, and as people trying to be living examples of peace that passeth all understanding. In other words, they sustained the hope of freedom in a seemingly hopeless situation. At times, King supports this view with a sweeping metaphysical view of human history as the struggle of good and evil, with evil always already doomed in the end. But almost immediately we realize a tension. While King speaks forthrightly of a God of power who can cut down giants of injustice wherever they emerge, he's always profoundly clear that it is human action that must bring this about. King retreats from the strongest formulations of inevitable progress and a theodicy that works entirely behind the backs of human beings. Perhaps if God dealt with evil in the overbearing way that we wish, King argues, he would defeat his ultimate purpose. By endowing us with freedom, God relinquished a measure of his own sovereignty and imposed certain limitations upon himself. If his children are free, they must do his will by a voluntary choice. If through sheer omnipotence God were to defeat his purpose, he would express weakness rather than power. Historical time, therefore, King tells us, is neutral on its own. The forces of good or evil may use it more effectively in any given moment. But while for King, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, it does come through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. In a sense, King inhabits the relationship to history and redemption that Eagleton identifies with the New Testament. In absence of the Messiah's return, he argues, Christians understand themselves as exercising a small portion of his power on behalf of the oppressed, bringing the poor to power in the hope of hastening his advent. In this way, some measure of the task of redeeming history is placed in our hands. So beneath the sweeping pronouncements concerning the moral arc of the universe, there's a remarkable insistence in King on contingency and freedom against fatalism and determinism. To sink in the quicksands of fatalism is both intellectually and psychologically stifling, King argues. Freedom is part of the essence of man. The fatalist, by denying freedom, becomes a puppet, not a person. To buttress this, King tries to persuade us by speaking of the unexpected political victories over feudalism, chattel slavery, colonialism, and now Jim Crow. Today, when progress has abruptly stalled and hope withers under bitter backlashing, King proclaims, Negroes can remember days that were incomparably worse. But that doesn't make him a Pollyannish celebrator of capital P progress. All progress is precarious, he notes. And the solution of one problem just brings us face to face with another. The crippling of oppressive systems like colonialism and slavery, he reminds us, and where do we go from here, never came in one fell swoop of immediacy. A final victory is an accumulation of many short-term encounters. To lightly dismiss a success, he writes, because it does not usher in a complete order of justice, is to fail to comprehend the process of achieving full victory. It underestimates the value of confrontation and dissolves the confidence born of a partial victory by which new efforts are powered. The worst thing, King warns, is to lose confidence in the face of obstacles simply because one imagines that progress is a straight line. The key, I think, is to keep the memory of struggles on behalf of justice and the heroic efforts to bring us closer to the kingdom of God alive and honored, even if partial and defeated. Such a kingdom, King argues, may remain not yet as a universal reality in history. In the present, it may exist in such isolated forms as in judgment, in personal devotion, and in some group life. What does he mean by this? Well, in Trumpet of Conscience, King discusses, for example, the Underground Railroad, which he admits never saved very many African Americans. But his greatest contribution was symbolic. It symbolized hope when freedom was almost an impossible dream. It reminded Black people and their allies that some small part of freedom is in our hands as collective praxis and intergenerational treasure. Hope for King is related to these practices of critique and resistance in the past and present that reveal the contingency of various forms of social oppression and contribute to their defeat. For Christians who evoke faith in the kingdom of God or beloved community as an ultimate ideal, their hope may have a more profound relationship to critique and revolution than it might appear to Brother Malcolm. Such faith divest all times to come of their false appearance as absolute futures, making enemies of political complacency as well as metaphysical despair. Yet this raises still an important question of political ethics. King describes his prophetic Christian faith and broader commitment to hope as a kind of refusal to be stopped, a courage to be, a determination to go on in spite of. The man who has made this discovery, King argues, knows that no burden can overwhelm him and no wind of adversity can blow his hope away. Channeling that talk of the sublime, he says, he can stand anything that can happen to him. But should we really seek out this kind of endurance that can bear any burden in the realm of the politics of racial and economic justice? When King brings those metaphysical speculations down to earth, or more specifically, to the bloody soil of the United States, is this faith or hope politically reasonable? Might it not be a kind of cruel optimism that attaches us further to an abusive social order that counts on and puts to good use the naive forbearance of its oppressed peoples? When King declares that we're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands, how are we to inherit such prophecies many, many years later in the polarized, decadent, corrupt, and cruel nation we've inherited along with them? I confess that my answer is simply another question. How can we not? I share tonight this unfamiliar king, not simply to underscore his radicalism as I and many others have done, but to try to put a nail in the coffin of a certain kind of romance about King and about the civil rights movement, one that treats them as somehow so attuned to triumphalism and consensus that they were oblivious to the tragic dimensions of political struggle. Whatever uses such romanticism may have served in the past, those days are now gone. There's a reason that even Elizabeth Alexander, once recruited to deliver the inaugural poem for the nation's first African-American president, bestowed on the Black youth who grew to adulthood during his ascendancy the epithet of the Trayvon generation, rather than name them after the politician for whom she wrote praise song for the day. We must come to terms with the fact that we are approaching the end of the time of romance with regard to civil rights memory and the people who promulgated it. There are dark days ahead. My book deals principally with the collapse of the romantic narrative of the civil rights history among liberals and the left, and tries to criticize the nihilism and Afro-pessimism that has come to be the dominant ironic response to that crisis. In the long years of composing this book, however, I've come to think of even these battles as preparation for a more epochal contest. Conservative praise for the civil rights movement, once compulsory and de rigueur, has receded. It's been replaced by a systematic push to dismantle its legal and moral legacy. Right-wing commentators like Christopher Caldwell now argue that civil rights became an overreaching doctrinal institution, while others seek to delegitimize the 1964 Civil Rights Act by linking it to reverse racism and the scourge of wokeness. Under Chief Justice John Roberts, the Supreme Court has rolled back affirmative action, narrowed disparate impact standards, and gutted the Voting Rights Act, exposing Black voters to renewed disenfranchisement and racial gerrymandering. These measures echo the creation of one-party authoritarian enclaves that once thrived under Jim Crow, allowing single-party controlled legislatures to concentrate power, purge opposition, and expand political repression with impunity. Simultaneously, authoritarian tendencies have curtailed public protest and undermined free expression, often under the pretext of security. Post-9/11 policing practices, relaxed gun laws, and penal expansions on demonstrators have emboldened vigilantes and chilled dissent. Bans on books and critical scholarship further stifle debate. Political scientists who sound alarms about partisan polarization and democratic backsliding are calling for a renewed commitment to multiracial democracy many decades too late. And one can only imagine how these pleas ring hollow for marginalized communities that never experience the democracy that they claim we're backsliding from. The romantic civil rights narrative, once widely invoked and now fractured amid deepening voter suppression, intensified propaganda, and a public sphere increasingly hostile to dissent, has become an obstacle for our thinking. We find ourselves in a different world, one to invoke King's last speech and its Exodus motif, one which Professor Glaude has taught us so much about. We find ourselves in a kind of wilderness, a thicket of cynicism, criminality, and authoritarianism is taking up space all around us. We hear sounds of selfishness, celebrations of cruelty and humiliation, and have a difficult time telling whether we are already surrounded and lost. We are told that here, in this wild place, cooperation and care are for losers, and that the rational ones are the ones that hoard opportunity for themselves and for their children alone. We are told, with pretensions of Olympian authority, that not all of us can make it in this kind of place. So we have to cut loose anybody we see stumble and not trouble ourselves over what potential we have extinguished. We are weathering an unyielding, smugly delivered propaganda war against so-called wokeness that is supposed to make you feel ashamed for having ever cared about others who are different, for being embarrassed. It wants you to feel embarrassed for being curious about how our society came to look the way it does. Embarrassed for wanting to learn from the evils of the past and be better in your own life. For stumbling along the way, perhaps, but trying to listen to those who might speak on what Ralph Ellison called the lower frequencies and figure out if those voices speak for you as well. To feel embarrassed for daring to dream that we could actually shape a new world, one worthy of our affirmation and our stated ideals. This cynicism, this propaganda, is wilderness talk. And while wilderness rears its head in every age, it may be true that this time right now it threatens to do damage that no society can return from. But in my better moments, I'm of the view that the only way to begin to turn the tide against the cynicism that has so corroded and corrupted our political culture is to try to have these exemplary demonstrations of tragic hope that cause us to put ourselves at some risk in search of solidarity, the way that King and many others in the civil rights movement did. It's not clear to me how else you get out of a death spiral of mutually reinforcing cynicism. What need is there for hope, Terry Eagleton asks us, when one can be the author of oneself? To say, I hope to do so, is to concede that there are limits to one's power. Hope and humility are, in this sense, bedfellows. This tragic hope calls us to attend to that humility that comes from a sense of our interdependency, our finitude, and the contingency of our action. It calls us to respond with virtues of maturity, taking responsibility for things that we did not foresee. We do so. We practice tragic hope in part by reopening the past to new descriptions and new judgments, guided by a thread that shows, in fragmentary form if necessary, that this kind of action, these kinds of ideals have been possible. We try to show how they've been forged into a fragmentary tradition that we can appeal to in order to nourish our critical sensibilities and inspire our solidarity. This stance of tragic hope does not, however, evade the depth of death and defeat, but recovers it through a sense of meaningful possibility, a sense of value and contingency. The knowledge that valuable ideas, valuable practices, and above all, valuable people will be lost in the pursuit of our aims. That's what grounds a tragic vision. It's the pessimist, in the last instance, that diminishes the sense of value and worth with every scornful remark about the impossibility of change and the foolishness of the attempt. Tragedy makes us no promise or guarantee of what will follow from our acts or in what matter. But this unpredictability lays bare our responsibilities to the past and the future for passing on what we want to survive and disavowing what we do not. Most challenging of all, tragic hope takes seriously the possibility that we are not yet in the worst of all worlds. And it is part of our responsibility to prevent further catastrophe from coming into being. Du Bois speaks in Of Beauty and Death of a great battle before the Lord. I know not what cosmic significance our crystallizing struggle with authoritarianism portends, but it seems clear that we should not lose our grip on the exemplarity of the civil rights movement simply because our romantic narratives no longer hold the quasi-religious authority they once did. Their collapse, despite all the disorientation this entails, is also an opportunity. It allows us, in Hannah Arendt's phrase, to think without banisters, to revisit the experiences, the events, the personalities of the past, and remake our own stories of peoplehood, to retrain our judgment, and to remake the concepts we use to gain purchase of the world. And we can think about those things in light of our own challenges with authoritarianism, with cruelty, with corruption across the polity. In the spirit of Du Bois's great battle, let us learn that this particular ending can become a new opening, a sublime summons to defiance, a sublime summons to the unfinished work of resisting the ugliness that continues to stake its claim upon this world, our world. Thank you.
I don't know what to do, what to say. I agree with so much of what you said. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. Can we? Absolutely brilliant. I only have a few questions, and hopefully this will be a conversation, not an interrogation. There was someone a reader of John Dewey, who said that his invocation of critical intelligence couldn't possibly do everything that he's suggesting that it can do. Yeah. That perhaps something else is underneath this. That because he has given up on metaphysics, God is not there for him. He holds on to critical intelligence for dear life. I'm wondering if tragic hope functions this way for you. That there is something that you are trying to beat back, hold off. Yeah. Talk a little bit about what motivates this turn, right? What is behind this? You see what I'm asking?
I certainly do. Again, it's an honor to be in conversation with you, and thank you for starting with the hardest question.
It's the honest question, right?
No, I appreciate it. So when I first started writing this book, I felt myself struggling and straining against what I've called the romantic narrative, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that what the civil rights movement teaches us is that good essentially overcomes evil, that underneath all of our superficial disagreements and division, there's really a consensus that if we could just get to it and refocus us, redisclose it, then we'll come to recognize what we always already knew, right? That's what I was striving against. And so much of that was the Obama era and how he narrated himself as the culmination of those things. But the undercurrent, as you well know, especially in the academy over those years, became the ascendancy of a certain kind of pessimism. And it's one that I admit spoke trenchantly to me as somebody who came out of a Black nationalist tradition, who takes these arguments really, really seriously, and who always has the truly disadvantaged in mind, people in my family who are the worse off, who look upon some of the things that people exhort them to and say, why? Why would I sacrifice for this when these people don't show up for me? Why are you preaching to me about this holiday or this celebration or affirmative action? That has nothing to do with the horizons of my life.
Right.
Right? So that pessimism is a real thing for me. And I started to get into, there was a brief moment where I got into really pessimistic philosophy, people like Schopenhauer, when you just say, well, man, you shouldn't be an Afro-pessimist, you should just be a regular pessimist about the whole thing. And when you really confront that, I think it's a serious question, and to try to give people a sense, at least in my narrow slice of the world, like what are the kinds of arguments people give when they say, it's hopeless, this isn't worth doing, all I can do is get mine, right? To just try to respond to that with some sensitivity and seriousness. And to me, that language of tragedy just seemed to open up an acknowledgement of all that defeat and disappointment and death, real loss, while not giving up on the possibility that things could be different, that there's things still worth hoping for and valuing in the world.
So this gives me, this is a wonderful opening. I'm just going to pursue this line of questioning for a little bit. So you do this exquisite reading of Du Bois's essay, and I kept wanting to read it against the comet. Right. So there is the river.
Yeah.
Right. But the comet is so much darker than the river. Now, obviously, anyone who's read my work knows that I'm in agreement with you. Right? I'm always trying to hold on to an abiding faith in the capacities of everyday, ordinary people to fundamentally transform their situations, to be able to see beyond the opacity of their condition, to use Charles Long's language, right? But the comet, this short story, right, you see this opening, and then there's a reassertion of the ugliness of the world. Right. Or you think about Du Bois in his autobiography, the older Du Bois, right? And you see, in some ways, his reflections on the journey, right? And there's a kind of bitterness there.
Sure.
Or
Well-deserved.
Or you think about Baldwin. You can only go to Texas so many times, he says in that last interview. You feel like a broken motor saying the same thing over and over again. What do you make of the reading that you offer of that essay and the conclusion? Because that's the last piece in Dark Water. Right. You know.
Well, there are two features.
You have to read the short story. I didn't want to give it away. But
somebody's gonna run out of here and get it from the library now.
Exactly.
There's two elements of the comet story which I think are really fascinating and resonant with the reading I give. So one is that, so again, I could only go into it so much in this talk, but part of being overwhelmed with the confrontation of the Grand Canyon is that he sees it at night. Right? So it's like, I can't even find my bearings. Like I can't tell which way is up, which way is down, what cliff is bare, which one's covered with trees. I can't make sense of anything. And then day breaks. And the reason I dwell on that is that this is a thing that doesn't happen because of his will. He doesn't will the day to break. He can't snap his fingers and say, let there be light so I can figure out what's going on. It has to happen outside of him, right? And I bring that up because that's what the comet is, right? The comet is another occasion. So to me, it's a sense of Du Bois's deep commitment all throughout his sociological writings, his historical writings, to contingency. Something happens outside of you. You had a plan. It's Mike Tyson line, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face, right? This is a thing that happened, and that's what occasions the possibility for remaking something or doing something differently. Now, the other part of that is
yes, the moment that they have, the brief moment that suggests there's a possibility that a new kind of relation might be made between black and white, that gets foreclosed. But there's another way to read that essay, which is, what is the memory of that moment doing for those characters as they move forward? Right?
Glance.
Yeah, they glance. It's
The glance that she gives at the end.
What
right?
is in that glance? Is that glance something that they remember and carry on into some new form of action, some new sense of possibility, some new educated form of judgment? Or is it nothing? Right? The pessimist will tell us it's nothing. That the world should have ended.
Right.
But I linger on the glance.
Right, and we have to ask why. Why we linger on the glance instead of concluding these damn devils. Right? And that takes me to this question. Is it an adequate response to the Grand Inquisitor? Right? So remember,
Say more.
Jesus comes back and doesn't matter. I mean, there's a judgment about human beings. I'm trying to figure out what's this anthropology that's driving this thing, right? Because what is the Grand Inquisitor saying about us? Right? I know, I just said I have a fundamental faith in the capacity of everyday ordinary human beings. That faith is going to be evidenced in that glance means something, right? That moment of, recoil. Like, the Afro-pessimist stays there.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in come here, baby. Right? The moment in which they recoil into arms. Right? So what is this philosophical anthropology that undergirds your faith in the glance? I feel like I'm acting like Cornell. You see what I'm doing? You see what I'm asking?
Absolutely.
And so the Grand Inquisitor provides this extraordinary challenge to our position. So I need some help.
Yeah. So to me, I think what the radical part of tragedy is that it doesn't try to conclude, to neatly wrap up the question, right? So there's a way in which, in King, that's why I say it's an interpretive key, because I think he says lots of different things over his career.
Right.
There are times where he just says, look, human beings rightly constituted will respond to undeserved suffering with care and compassion, with shame even, for how they've contributed to the evil that unfolds before them. But the question is, why are they not so rightly constituted? Stokely Carmichael says, are white Americans even capable of shame? The shame that would become a revolutionary emotion. I bring all that up to say, it's like, what is perhaps the distinguishing feature of our political and popular culture of the moment is its shamelessness.
Wholly absent.
That it seems almost impossible to shame most people who are thrust in front of us in public life. So there are powerful reasons to be skeptical about any concrete notion of philosophical anthropology that would provide a necessary and sufficient bulwark against the suspicion. But the tragedian is telling a story that are these moments linked together in a fragmentary history that happened. So again, that's what the thing begins with. Jim Crow car is real, but so is the sunset on Montego Bay. All of the cruelty you can point to that says human beings are only capable of the worst, that's true. But if I can hold out some possibilities and tell you the story of why they cascade into something meaningful, that's why the historical work is so fascinating.
Right.
And to me, it just can't be fictional. Like if I really pressed, I would say it's gotta be something that's real. It can't just be told to us. It matters because it's holding out. We have seen it. We don't see it all the time. It may disappear for long stretches. It may disappear for our whole life. But it happened. That's why you don't give up on something like the civil rights movement. For all of the reasons we don't like the romantic story, there's still something in its exemplarity that's worth revisiting because something did happen of world historical consequence.
Right. I'm reminded of that moment at the end of Moral Inhabitants, which was Toni Morrison's response to James Baldwin's talk at the Bicentennial in 1976. And she quotes Annie Dillard. And after she lists all of this ugliness, she says, but there is still the canary that sings on the skull. Beauty still evidences itself in the midst of all of that ugliness. Now, let's get to romantic history. Y'all all right? You good? Okay, just checking on you. This romance of history, right? I mean, I'm wondering from which direction. Is the romantic story, this romantic rendering of history, a political project? Like that the civil rights story comes to us in a certain kind of way and for particular purposes.
Yeah.
Right? So what if it's not just, our orientation to history as such, but in some ways our being captured by a certain black liberal,
sure,
by a certain kind of black liberal political imagination. And so we're not critiquing history, we're critiquing a particular rendering of it for particular purposes.
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Okay.
Okay, that's obviously a big part of the book is a critique of the ways in which Obama tells the story of the civil rights movement and connects it to things that he argues about moral judgment and political judgment. But two pieces here. So one is, I think it's a much bigger problem than black liberalism. It's all over the place, right? Right in this book, every single president is giving a version of this. It doesn't matter if they're conservative, like George W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, they're all running this story. And they ramp it up to the point where it's not just a story about American civic religion or about the goodness of American peoplehood. It's about modernity. It's about why is America the quintessential modern nation, right? It's about, do we have faith in the capacity of human beings to be good, right? People really weave it into whole theodicies from the modern, about the legitimacy of the modern age. That's one point. Second point is that I think some of it is volitional and intentional in politics. When Obama sets himself up as the Joshua generation, that's very intentional and deliberate and biblically illiterate.
Yes. Okay.
But there's a deeper kind of epistemological thing going on, which is that a bunch of the assumptions that people have long made about how to understand black folks and talk about black folks and think about black folks, they feed into the idea that the romantic narrative makes any sense. So what are these ideas? The idea that the church is necessarily the vanguard institution of black political life, the idea that you can map black political conflict on the axis of integration versus separatism. Separatists are almost always the bad guys, nationalists. The idea that there's something like a kind of cultural politics of representation that makes sense, that we can speak on behalf and present good images of the race, right? The idea that races are real, that blackness captures some stable entity of people and some stable cohort of people that we can always pick out reliably in the world. Those things have all collapsed for lots and lots of good reasons.
Right.
And this is the kind of hermeneutics point. It's like, once those things collapse, the kind of romantic stories we want to tell, they just don't work anymore because they can't draw upon the resources of common sense in the culture that make them make sense. Now you hear a story about representing a race, you say, well, what did they do with the queer people in the civil rights movement? They obviously weren't on stage. What were they doing about?
Maybe.
Or they weren't out and open on stage.
There you go.
Right. What are we doing with the class distinctions? Right. What do you do when the people who seem to be most in the lineage of the civil rights movement say we don't want anything to do with black church leadership, right? So these are the fractures that are happening in our moment, and we cannot help but read them back into the past and see things that we haven't seen before.
Absolutely.
So those romantic stories just start to break down because we're asking different questions from our own vantage.
So we're running out of time because we want to let the library folks get home. They got to be. They've been working all day. You ended in a place that was really, really powerful and important. One of the interesting things about the Trump era is that they're trying to go back to a moment where the civil rights narrative was not yoked to the American story.
Right.
They're trying to go back to that period in the early part of the 20th century, where a notion of the white American was so central to our identity and our policy and whatnot. As you see what's happening, how would you suggest, and I get asked this question all the time, so I'm going to ask you this question. How would you suggest we best orient ourselves? You said it at the end, but I want you to say it again in a different way. We best orient ourselves to the madness that threatens to overwhelm. There's the pounding of the skull that Jimmy Baldwin, this is how Baldwin described the fever dream, its effects, the pounding of the skull, the irritable bowel, right? Which is the madness that threatens to overwhelm us in the face of it all. How does tragic hope help us orient ourselves in this moment?
I think one thing it teaches us, especially coming out of now, I think we can just openly say the defeat of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives. I think it offers us a diagnosis for our despair. To be honest, that part of the reason we have such despair comes from the way in which we articulated our hopes for so long, from the Obama period to the BLM period. And the ways in which those hopes carried within them, like tragedy teaches us, many of the seeds of their own demise. And that an honest attempt to rebuild has to go back through painstakingly the ruins of those dreams and be really brutally honest with ourselves about, for example, how did the critique of charisma make us oblivious to its reemergence in a form that didn't look like the exemplarity of Martin Luther King? So that it so dulled our political judgment that we couldn't recognize when the charismatic leaders were telling us they were against charismatic leaders. Okay? That's a kind of disorientation we have to be honest about, without saying that it was all pointless, that we didn't learn anything. And that's why I end on this. I'll end on this one piece. It's like there's a major passage in Souls of Black Folk, and I've read it 1,000,000 times and always skipped over it. But right at the beginning of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, he describes the era of Booker T's emergence as one where the nation grew ashamed of having spent so much time on Negroes and devoted its attention to dollars. It's like, what does it mean to be ashamed in that moment? That's what the war on wokeness really is. And that's, of all things, I just want to leave, especially this audience, with that. It's like, that so much of the propaganda is meant to make you feel ashamed of joining those reading groups, of trying to understand something about the country that you live in, of entertaining ideas that aren't obvious to you and haven't been told to you your whole life, of trying to venture clumsily, flailingly, sometimes ass backwardly, venturing to think new thoughts and imagine what else might be done with a society with this extraordinary level of wealth and possibility. I think we're in a terrible time where the romance is dead and the temptations of irony in the face of that attempt to make us ashamed will make us feel like there's a sophisticated version of being ashamed that counts as theoretical sophistication. And I want us to resist that, because I think there's another way of telling our story of the civil rights movement, the story of Reconstruction, that permits us to have a different kind of revolutionary hope than we have on offer.
I think Professor Brandon Terry. He has just really, he has offered us resources to come to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in a different way, with a different posture. Thank you again, Doc.